4 feet. That's all it was. 4 feet between 11-month-old Sarah and the man they called the Steel Shadow, and every armed guard in that corridor stopped breathing. No footsteps, no radio static, no whispered warnings. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to go silent. Maria's heart seized. She could see her baby's tiny hands gripping the polished marble floor, her chubby knees moving forward with that fearless determination only children have. But what really made Maria's blood run cold was his posture. Ralph King hadn't moved. His tattooed hands still rested on the mahogany desk in his study, but his eyes had shifted down to track every inch of Sarah's crawl toward him. The strange thing was, he hadn't called for the guards. That thought terrified her even more. Ralph didn't speak. No shouting, no commands. Nothing. Just those steel-gray eyes fixed on the child moving toward him like she was the only person in the building, like he was trying to understand a language he'd never learned. Maria's mind raced. You know that feeling when you realize your one mistake has just exposed you to something far more dangerous than being fired? That everything you've hidden is about to unravel? That's what crashed over her. Behind her, one of the junior maids whispered in horror, "Is that a baby?" Then came the sound of holsters unclasping. Multiple weapons. Perfect. Now she was caught. The desperate gamble she'd made, bringing her daughter to work, hidden in the basement staff quarters, had just blown up exactly like she feared. But here's what those guards didn't know. The man whose attention Sarah had just captured? He wasn't going to react the way anyone expected. And what happens next will shock everyone in that mansion. Maria's story didn't start in that corridor. It started 4 months earlier in a basement room that smelled like bleach and desperation. Most people don't know what it's like to be invisible. To scrub floors in a mansion where one sculpture costs more than you'll earn in your entire life. To walk past men in $1,000 suits who look through you like you're made of air. But Maria knew. She'd been invisible for 4 months. 4 months since she'd fled from an abusive relationship with Sarah strapped to her chest and nothing but a bus ticket and $63 in her pocket. 4 months of telling herself that if she just kept her head down, worked harder than anyone else, maybe she could build something here. The job at the King estate came through whispers and desperation. Her friend's cousin knew someone who knew someone. That's how it works when you're running from danger. You don't apply online, you don't negotiate, you take what you can get and pray they don't ask questions. The rules were simple. You clean, you stay quiet, you never go near Mr. King's private wing. Mrs. Chen, the head of household, had told her on day 1, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Mr. King doesn't like to see the staff. If he sees you, you're gone. No warnings, no second chances. Maria had nodded. She was good at being invisible. But there was one problem she hadn't solved. Sarah. Daycare cost money she didn't have. The other maids would report a baby instantly. Too much liability, too much noise, and leaving Sarah alone in that tiny rented room across town. That wasn't even an option. So Maria did what desperate mothers do. She got creative. The basement staff quarters became Sarah's nursery. A nest of clean blankets, soft towels to muffle sounds, a bottle and quiet toys. Maria would prop the door just enough to hear any cries, clean the upper floors in record time, checking every 15 minutes. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was survival. For 3.5 months, it worked. Sarah was unusually quiet, watching the world with huge, dark eyes. Like she understood that silence meant safety. Sometimes Maria would peek in and find her daughter just observing, taking everything in with impossible calmness. "You're too brave for your own good," Maria would whisper during stolen moments, holding Sarah close. "Just like your grandmother." Then Mrs. Chen changed everything. "You're being moved." Then executive wing starting Monday. Maria's stomach dropped. The executive wing, where Ralph King actually lived and worked, where cameras covered every corner and armed guards stood at every door, where there were no hidden basement rooms, where there was no place to hide a baby. That night, Maria sat on her narrow bed, holding Sarah close. Her daughter had just learned to crawl, those first wobbly, determined movements that every mother celebrates, but all Maria could think was, "This is how we get caught. This is how we lose everything." Monday morning came too fast. The executive wing was a different world. Marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Art that probably cost more than Maria would earn in 10 years. And silence, the kind of silence that came from power and fear. Maria had improvised desperately. She'd found a small storage alcove near the service elevator, barely big enough for Sarah's portable playpen, but it would have to do. She'd left her daughter there with toys, a bottle, and a prayer that she'd stay quiet for just 2 hours, while Maria completed her morning tasks. But she'd underestimated one thing: Sarah's newfound mobility and her complete lack of fear. 90 minutes into her shift, Maria was polishing the hallway fixtures outside Ralph King's private study when she heard it, the distinctive sound of the storage alcove door opening. She turned, and her heart stopped. Sarah had somehow pushed open the door. She was crawling down the hallway, moving with that determined baby focus toward the one door that should have been closed but wasn't, Ralph King's study. Maria dropped her cloth and ran, but she was too far away. By the time she reached the study doorway, Sarah had already crossed the threshold, and Ralph King was staring directly at her. He sat behind his massive desk, phone in hand mid-conversation, his expression unreadable. Tattoos crawled up from his collar, intricate patterns that spoke of a violent past. His reputation preceded him. The Steel Shadow, the man who'd built a criminal empire through ruthlessness and calculated terror. Sarah crawled right up to his chair. Then she did something that made every guard in the hallway reach for their weapons. She grabbed Ralph King's pant leg and pulled herself up to standing, wobbling on unsteady legs, looking up at the most dangerous man in the city with a toothless, delighted smile, and laughed. Not a cry, not fear, pure, delighted baby laughter. Ralph ended his phone call without saying goodbye, his eyes never leaving Sarah. He set the phone down slowly. The silence stretched like broken glass. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, waiting for the explosion, the command to have her removed, the end of everything she'd fought so hard to build. But Ralph didn't call for security. He didn't shout. He didn't even stand up. Instead, he did something that made every guard in that hallway question reality. Ralph King leaned down, and with hands that had ended lives, he carefully, gently, picked up Sarah and set her on his knee. And Sarah, fearless and trusting in that way only babies can be, grabbed his tattooed finger and refused to let go. Ralph looked at that tiny hand wrapped around his finger for a long moment. Then his eyes lifted to Maria, still frozen in the doorway. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, and completely unreadable. "This is yours?" Maria's throat was too tight to speak. She managed a nod. Ralph looked back down at Sarah, who was now trying to grab his expensive watch with both hands, babbling happily. "How long has she been in my house?" Maria forced words out. 4 months, sir. I'm sorry. I had nowhere else. I can leave right now. I just need to... Stop. One word. Absolute authority. Maria's mouth snapped shut. Ralph studied Sarah's face like he was solving a complex equation. Sarah, completely unbothered by the tension, patted his cheek with her chubby hand and laughed again. And something shifted in Ralph King's expression, something that looked almost like pain, almost like wonder, almost like a man seeing light after years of darkness. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Sarah." Ralph tested the name, his eyes still on the baby who'd somehow decided the most feared man in the city was her new favorite person. "Sarah," he repeated. Then to Maria, "You've been hiding her in the basement. It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir." "For 4 months." "Yes, sir." Ralph was quiet for another long moment. Sarah had now abandoned his watch and was attempting to grab his tie, making happy gurgling sounds. Finally, Ralph spoke, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that made grown men obey without question. Mrs. Chen. The head of household appeared instantly, her face pale. "Yes, Mr. King. Clear the guest suite on the 3rd floor. Maria and her daughter will be staying there." Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide. "Sir, Did I stutter?" "No, sir. Right away, sir." She disappeared. Ralph looked back at Maria, who stood in complete shock. "You'll continue your duties," he said, "but Sarah stays where I can see her. The 3rd floor has a nursery. Use it." Maria's mind was reeling. "Sir, I don't understand." "You don't need to understand." Ralph's eyes finally released Sarah and locked onto Maria. "But I don't tolerate secrets in my house. So here's how this works. You want to stay? You stop hiding. Both of you." Sarah chose that moment to grab Ralph's face with both hands and plant a wet, slobbery baby kiss on his nose. Every guard in the hallway stopped breathing again, and Ralph King, the steel shadow, the man who hadn't smiled in anyone's memory, looked down at this fearless baby with something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. "Go," he said quietly to Maria. "Mrs. Chen will show you your new quarters." Maria wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what was happening, but survival instinct told her to accept the miracle and run with it. She reached for Sarah, but the baby's grip on Ralph's finger only tightened, and she made a protesting sound. Ralph looked at Sarah, then at Maria. "I'll bring her up in 10 minutes. "Sir, you don't have to." 10 minutes, he repeated. Then softer, "She's safe with me." And somehow, impossibly, Maria believed him. 3 feet. That was all it was. 3 feet of deep, crimson carpet between 10-month-old Sarah and the man they called the Steel Shadow. Every armed guard in the study stopped breathing. The very hum of the security cameras seemed to go silent in anticipation of a catastrophe. Maria's heart seized, her blood running cold as she watched her baby's tiny hands grip the edges of the mahogany desk. So her chubby knees moving forward with the fearless determination only children possess. Ralph King hadn't moved. His tattooed knuckles, etched with the floral patterns of a violent history, remained resting on the table, but his steel-gray eyes had shifted down to track every inch of Sarah's crawl. The silence was absolute, a lethal stasis that made the air feel heavy with the scent of expensive whiskey and impending doom. Ralph didn't speak. There were no shouting commands or outbursts of Mafia rage. He just stared at the child moving toward him, as if he were trying to understand a language he had never learned. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, the polishing cloth falling from her limp fingers. She knew that feeling, the total, systemic collapse of realized terror when a single mistake exposes a secret you would die to protect. Then behind her, the sound of holsters unclasping echoed like a death knell as the guards prepared to eliminate the intrusion. Then the impossible happened. Sarah reached the Steel Shadow and, instead of recoiling from his mechanical indifference, she reached up and wrapped her tiny, warm hand around his index finger. She looked up at the man who commanded death with a whisper and let out a bright, gummy laugh that shattered the mausoleum of marble silence. Ralph King, a predator who had forgotten the sound of a heartbeat, didn't pull away. Slowly, moving like he was defusing a bomb, he crouched down until he was eye level with the child. "Who does she belong to?" His voice came, a low-frequency hum that carried a sudden, raw, human vulnerability. Maria stepped into the shivering light of the study, her voice a fragile contrast to the vastness of the room. "She's mine, Mr. King. Please, I had nowhere else to take her." She braced for the permanent erasure of her job, for the order to be cast back onto the streets where her shadow of the past waited. Ralph's blade-like gaze shifted from the baby to Maria, missing nothing of her exhaustion or her fierce maternal terror. He looked back at Sarah, who was now patting his cheek with her free hand, oblivious to the weapons leveled in her direction. The steel shadow felt something crack, not break, but crack like ice that had been solid for far too long. "The child stays," Ralph commanded, his tone returning to an absolute authority that brooked no argument from his confused guards. "And the mother stays with her. Move them to the guest wing." The silent contract of Maria's life was officially voided. She was no longer a ghost, and the lion had chosen to stay his hand. The transition from the basement's invisible pathways to the palace walls of the guest wing happened with a speed that left Maria reeling, clutching Sarah to her chest, as if she still expected the steel shadow to change his mind. For 4 months, her existence had been defined by the smell of bleach and the desperate silence of the staff quarters, a world where she lived as a ghost, to keep her daughter safe. She had fled from a life that promised everything and delivered nothing, arriving at the King estate with nothing but a fake visa and the fierce maternal terror of a woman with nowhere left to run. The hidden nursery she had created in the basement was a masterpiece of desperate creativity, a nest of clean towels and soft rags tucked behind rows of industrial detergents designed to muffle the sounds of a growing child. Maria had become a master of the shield of invisibility, memorizing Ralph's schedule and finding camera blind spots to steal 10-minute intervals to nurse her daughter. She had told herself that if she just kept her head down and worked harder than anyone else, she could build a shroud of safety that the world couldn't pierce. But the executive floor was a different world, one where the marble was whiter and the silence was more absolute, enforced by twice as many guards who watched her with barely concealed hostility. As she settled Sarah into a high-end crib that cost more than several months of her old salary, Maria's hands shook with the icy pressure of her new reality. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a strategic pawn in a game she didn't understand. She looked at the iron-clad walls surrounding them and realized her smuggled life had been traded for a gilded trap. Sarah, however, remained completely oblivious to the atmosphere of terror, babbling happily as she reached for the plush fabrics that now surrounded her. She was too brave for her own good, observing the world with the same impossible calmness that had first captivated Ralph. Maria stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city she had navigated as a phantom. She realized that while she had finally escaped the bleach and desperation of the basement, she had stepped into a cathedral of cold violence. Ralph King had claimed they belonged to him, but in his world, belonging often came with a lethal stasis. The silent contract was changing, and as she watched the shivering light of the city, Maria wondered if she had traded one kind of prison for another, or if this mausoleum of marble could truly become the home she had been searching for. The lethal stasis of the mansion's hierarchy was shattered the next morning when Ralph King issued a decree that ignored every established survival rule of the estate. He didn't just want Maria to work. He commanded her to bring the baby into the Cathedral of Cold Violence that served as his main office. The invisible pathways Maria had once used to hide were now closed to her, so replaced by the shivering light of the executive floor where cameras tracked every movement and guards stood like strategic pawns at every door. As Maria pushed her cleaning cart, now emptied of its bleach and desperation, and repurposed into a mobile nursery, she felt the barely concealed hostility of the other staff. Whispers followed her like a jagged rasp through the corridors. She had jumped the line, transforming from a basement phantom to an executive floor fixture in a single night. The shield of invisibility she had worn as a domestic survivor was gone, leaving her exposed to the icy pressure of jealousy and the ruthless eyes of the Steel Shadow's inner circle. "Set her down," Ralph commanded as Maria entered the boardroom, his voice a low-frequency hum that made the men in $1,000 suits flinch. The Steel Shadow was in the middle of a total systemic negotiation, but his blade-like gaze was anchored entirely on Sarah. Maria's hands shook as she placed Sarah on the floor, watching as her daughter made a beeline for Ralph's chair with a soulful cadence of happy babbles. The men across the table looked like they were watching a surgical miracle or a disaster in the making. Ralph, the man who had built his empire on mechanical indifference, reached down and lifted the child into his lap without breaking eye contact with his rivals. Sarah immediately discovered the intricate tattoos on his neck, her chubby fingers tracing the floral patterns of his violent history as if they were nothing more than a picture book. "Where were we?" Ralph asked, his absolute authority chilling the air. He settled Sarah against his tattooed chest, using her presence as a raw human vulnerability that paradoxically made him sharper, calmer, and more terrifyingly centered. For the first time, Maria saw that Ralph wasn't just a monster. He was a titan who had found a root of truth in the girl who wasn't afraid to touch his scars. The silent contract between the maid and the boss had evolved into something that would shock everyone in that mansion. The Steel Shadow was building a nursery in the middle of a war zone. Ralph King had negotiated billion-dollar deals while staring down the barrel of a gun, but he had never tried to close a shipping contract while a 10-month-old was trying to eat his silk tie. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with a mechanical indifference that usually signaled a bloodbath. Yet the Steel Shadow sat unmoved as Sarah discovered the dangling fabric of his collar. Her gurgling laughter was a fragile contrast to the cold, calculating eyes of the Underworld Council members sitting across from them. The rival bosses looked like they were watching a nature documentary where the predator had suddenly decided to play with its food. Every time a rival tried to use his usual intimidation tactics, the long silences, the barely veiled threats, his eyes would inevitably drift to the baby, currently using the most dangerous man in Seoul as a jungle gym. It was a total systemic collapse of the traditional power dynamic. Ralph gently removed his Rolex from Sarah's grip before she could gum it to death, his blade-like gaze never leaving the men across the table. "I'm not occupied," Ralph stated, his voice a low-frequency hum of absolute authority as he shifted Sarah slightly. "I'm listening to you try to cheat me. Continue." Maria watched from the periphery, her hands shaking with a mix of awe and fierce maternal terror. She saw how Sarah made Ralph better at this. Her presence seemed to strip away the performance and leave only the root of truth. Ralph was no longer posturing. He didn't need to prove his lethality because he was too busy ensuring a baby didn't choke on his cufflinks. It was the most effective negotiating tactic Maria had ever witnessed. As the rivals broke under the pressure, agreeing to terms that were 20% higher than their final offer, they filed out looking vaguely traumatized. The door clicked shut, leaving only the soulful cadence of Sarah's happy babbling in the room. Ralph looked down at the child, the raw human vulnerability flickering across his sophisticated mask. He had built an empire on fear, but he was realizing that a 10-month-old child had just made him more powerful than 1,000 guns. Sarah didn't know about power or hierarchy. She just saw someone worth trusting. And for Ralph, that was the most shocking revelation of all. The mausoleum of marble began to thaw, not through a surgical miracle of wealth, but through a moment of raw human vulnerability that occurred during Sarah's afternoon nap. Ralph found himself standing in the doorway of the guest suite, watching the baby sleep with a mechanical indifference that was rapidly failing him. He had told himself he was merely reviewing the guard rotation or checking for a systemic breach in security. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was drawn to the shiver of life that now occupied his cold tomb of an empire. Maria sat in the corner, her hands shaking slightly as she folded tiny clothes with the rhythmic focus of a domestic survivor. When she noticed the Steel Shadow looming in the shivering light of the hallway, she stood quickly, her shield of invisibility instinctively snapping back into place. She still expected the permanent erasure of her safety, but Ralph stepped into the room, his blade-like gaze softened by an old pain. "She isn't afraid," Ralph stated, his voice a low-frequency hum that vibrated with a soulful cadence he hadn't used in 20 years. He looked at the intricate tattoos on his own hands, the private map of his violent history, and then back at the child who had grabbed his finger without hesitation. How is she like this? I am the man people pay to avoid. She doesn't know she's supposed to be afraid yet. Maria whispered, her voice a fragile contrast to the ironclad walls of the estate. She just sees someone who held her gently. She sees someone worth trusting. The question hung in the air like a lethal stasis, challenging Ralph to look past his sophisticated mask. Without a word, he produced a small silver bracelet, a gift that served as a shroud of safety and a root of truth. It was engraved with Sarah's name, a silent contract that she was no longer an invisible secret, but a protected heart of the King household. As he leaned over the crib, his tattooed chest tensing, he gently placed his finger in Sarah's palm, and her hand closed around it even in her dreams. Maria felt her martyr complex begin to dissolve, replaced by a traumatic silence of realization. Ralph wasn't just her protector, he was being changed by the very child he had saved. The Steel Shadow was learning a different language, and for the first time, Maria saw a shimmer of hope in the middle of a war zone. The lethal stasis of Ralph's newfound peace was shattered in the back room of a smoke-filled gambling den, where the Underworld Council had gathered to study a calculated risk. Photographs were spread across a scarred table, captured by a strategic pawn on the cleaning staff who had gotten close enough with a phone. The images were a surgical miracle of intelligence for Ralph's enemies. The Steel Shadow, a man who had been a cold tomb for 3 years, was actually smiling at a child. He's forgotten to guard his heart, the rival leader whispered, his voice a jagged rasp that cut through the mechanical indifference of the room. For years, Ralph King had operated like he was bulletproof because he had no attachments, no biological bridge to humanity that could be exploited. But now, the invisible pathways of his life were exposed. He had a blood leak in his reputation, and the council sensed opportunity the way sharks sense blood in the water. The plan was a permanent erasure of Ralph's authority, centered not on the man himself, but on the protected heart of his household. They identified a blind spot in the estate's security during shift changes, a 45-second window that was all they needed for a total systemic breach. While Maria sang a soulful cadence to Sarah in the nursery, oblivious to the rising storm, the council's men were preparing to turn the palace walls into a trap. "We aren't moving on King directly," the rival boss decided, his blade-like gaze fixed on the photo of Sarah's tiny hand resting against Ralph's cheek. "We're moving on what he cares about. I want him to feel exactly what he's losing." The atmosphere of terror began to shift outside the mansion's gates as the Shadow's weakness became the target of a fierce showdown. Maria's shield of invisibility was about to be forcibly stripped away, not by a man's mercy, but by the controlled violence of an empire that refused to let its king go soft. Every ironclad wall was about to be tested, and the silent contract of their safety was moments away from being burned to the ground. The shroud of safety Maria had built within the king estate was violently torn away at 11:47 p.m. when the first gunshot shattered the east wing window. The total systemic breach occurred during a 45-second blind spot in the guard rotation, exactly as the rivals had planned. As the power cut out, plunging the mausoleum of marble into a terrifying red emergency light, Maria's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Sarah!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the jagged rasp of automatic gunfire echoing through the corridors. She had been in the staff kitchen when the atmosphere of terror shifted, and now the invisible pathways she once knew were blocked by men in tactical gear. The Steel Shadow was already moving, his body reacting with mechanical indifference born of 15 years of survival. But his mind was anchored to one thing: the protected heart in the nursery. Ralph moved through the darkness like a phantom, his gun ready, navigating the iron-clad walls that had suddenly become a death trap. He found the nursery door hanging open, the shivering light of the red strobes casting jagged shadows across the room. Maria was already there, pressed into a corner, clutching Sarah to her chest with a fierce, maternal terror. "Give her to me," Ralph commanded, his voice a low-frequency hum of absolute authority. Maria hesitated for only a second before handing over the surgical miracle that had changed their lives. Ralph tucked Sarah against his tattooed chest with a devastating gentleness, his free hand steadying his weapon. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for territory or strategic pawns anymore. He was fighting for the only two people who had ever seen past his sophisticated mask. The fierce showdown was no longer a distant threat. It was in the hallway, at the door, and in the very air they breathed. As the attackers closed in, calling out for the package, Ralph understood that the Shadow's weakness had become his greatest source of controlled violence. He would burn his entire empire to the ground before he let them take the child who had refused to let him go. The lethal stasis of the hallway was incinerated as Ralph King stepped into the red emergency light, his presence a total systemic collapse for the intruders who had dared to enter his home. He moved with a mechanical indifference that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage, his blade-like gaze burning with a hellfire as he shielded Maria and Sarah with his own body. "He'll never touch you again." Ralph's voice came as a low-frequency hum of absolute authority, even as a bullet tore through the air grazing his shoulder. He didn't flinch. The tattooed chest tensing as he absorbed the impact was the only sign he had been hit. His titanium grip on his weapon remained steady, answering the jagged rasp of the enemy's gunfire with surgical precision. Maria watched from the floor, her hands shaking as she saw the steel shadow become a literal shield of meat and bone. In the midst of the controlled violence, Ralph reached back, his hand finding Maria's in a devastating gentleness that promised a permanent erasure of their fear. He wasn't just a mafioso in this moment. He was a protector who had traded his sophisticated mask for the raw human vulnerability of a man who refused to lose his family twice. The fierce showdown reached its peak in the narrow stairwell. Ralph fired his final rounds, neutralizing the immediate threat and creating a shroud of safety long enough to reach the reinforced doors of the safe room. As the heavy steel began to hiss shut, Ralph collapsed against the frame, blood soaking his white silk shirt, yet his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. The baby, miraculously unharmed, reached out her tiny hand to touch the jagged marks of blood on his cheek. The total restoration of Ralph King was complete. He had taken a bullet for a root of truth he had only just discovered. "Thank you for not letting go," Maria whispered, her shield of invisibility finally discarded for the ironclad safety of the man who had truly seen her. The traumatic silence that had once haunted the halls of the King estate was replaced by the shivering light of a new dawn, filtering through the reinforced glass of the master suite. Ralph King sat by the window, his shoulder bandaged beneath a fresh silk shirt, no longer the steel shadow residing in a cold tomb of an empire. He had survived the fierce showdown, and in doing so, he had found a root of truth that no amount of blood-stained power could buy. Maria entered the room, moving no longer as a phantom or a ghost, but with the absolute authority of a woman who had finally discarded her shield of invisibility. She carried Sarah, who immediately let out a soulful cadence of laughter at the sight of Ralph. Ralph watched them with a blade-like gaze that had softened into a devastating gentleness, his tattooed chest tensing, not with violence, but with a raw human vulnerability. "I built this mausoleum of marble to keep the world out," Ralph said, his voice a low-frequency hum. "But you and Sarah brought the light back in." He reached out, his titanium grip now a practiced surgical miracle of comfort, as he took Sarah's tiny hand in his own. He looked at Mariah, the silent contract of employer and maid officially dissolving between them. I'm making a king's vow today," he stated, his sophisticated mask gone for good. "Within these palace walls, you are the protected heart. No one will ever mark what belongs to me again." He promised her a life where she would never have to be a domestic survivor again, proposing a total restoration of their family under his ironclad protection. As Sarah reached up to pat Ralph's cheek, Maria realized that the steel shadow didn't just save them from the monster of her past. He had saved himself from a lethal stasis of the soul. The fierce showdown had ended in a proposal of peace that would shock everyone in the underworld. "Yes," Maria whispered, her voice a rhythmic melody that finally filled the cathedral of cold violence with a shimmer of hope.